Last month, we hosted a small youth con here at the church. The day ended with a youth-led worship right here, which included one of my very favorite circle worship activities, the creation of a yarn web. We had one ball of yarn, which we threw to each other while holding on to a piece, right? So we throw it and there's a string that connects us, as we took turns sharing something we were taking away from the day. At the end, we all pulled the yarn taut and held it up a little to admire the web we had created. The yarn intertwined, strong, and connected. It is the classic symbol of interdependence, that web connecting us all, each of us holding our piece, creating something together that is far stronger than any of us could create alone. It's the perfect image when you want to talk about working together, how we each need to carry our part of the load, how the gifts that each one of us brings are an integral part of that web. But it begins to break down quite literally when someone lets go. If one person drops their part of the yarn web, it can sometimes set off a chain reaction as the web loosens and shifts. In the worst case scenario, it's the beginning of the end, as other web holders try to compensate, tugging the yarn out of someone else's hand or letting the whole thing devolve into a tangled mess. And it then becomes a metaphor for our very worst fear, at least the worst fear of those of us who, like me, feel a really deep sense of responsibility for holding our part of the web. That if we let go, it all falls apart. What happens if we don't or can't hold up our piece? What happens if we say no? I know that I too often get myself into a place where I feel like I can't let go, when I worry that if I do, it will all fall into a tangled mess. Have you ever felt like that? The idea of interdependence, of each of our gifts being important, the idea that what we do matters, can be so empowering. I want to think that I bring something unique and important to the world, don't you? And the flip side of that is that it can feel like a lot of pressure. If each of us is integral to the work of building a better world, for example, what does that mean when we need to take a break? When our sense of interdependence moves from empowerment to pressure, that can be dangerous. This is when we begin to feel like the weight of the whole world is on our shoulders. And when we place that sense of responsibility ahead of our own well-being, it can pretty quickly lead to burnout. This is exactly where we find the characters in the movie Encanto, that's the one Sadie was talking about, when the story begins. A whole family of people who are burnt out because they feel that weight of the world on their shoulders. There is this sense that the whole town depends on them and their gifts, and if they aren't perfect, or if they even take a moment to rest, it will all fall apart. That's a lot of pressure. No wonder they are all starting to crumble under the weight of it. As Sadie described, it all started very idyllic, with the lovely and magical Madrigal family who worked hard to care for those in the village near their magical home. But throughout the movie, each character admits how overwhelmed they are by the pressure of it all. And eventually, all of their gifts disappear under that pressure. Even their magical house crumbles away. And that's where we find them, at the beginning of the song we heard earlier, standing in front of their literally crumbled home, starting to try to put together the pieces of their lives as they learn to exist without magic. And my favorite part of the movie is what comes next. Once they all have realized that maybe they were carrying a little too much, admitted that the way they were living wasn't working, a crowd of people from the village come up the road, carrying tools, ready to help them rebuild. Lay down your load, they sing, as they begin to build a new home for the family, all of them together. What I see in this scene is the true magic of interdependence. By recognizing that they needed to do a little less, to set some boundaries, by recognizing that they were trying to carry too much, the Madrigal family made space for others to help carry that load. It was not until they stopped over-functioning that the rest of the town was able to be fully a part of the web holding them all together. And this is the lesson that I think Encanto holds for all of us. It's not interdependence if we feel like we are carrying the weight of the world on our shoulders. Interdependence is about helping and working together, absolutely, but it is also about boundaries, setting boundaries, and caring for ourselves. Sometimes saying no can make space for even more interdependence to arise. In our words for reflection, Caitlin Curtis writes, "Many of us learn to be afraid of how relationships will turn out if we enact boundaries, and we learn to give up parts of ourselves in order to maintain peace in the process." This is no way to live, and it is deeply counter to the interdependence that we are trying to practice here. We are, all of us, worthy of saying no, worthy of setting boundaries, worthy of not burning ourselves out. 6 years ago, at this time of year, I was preparing to take my very first parental leave from this congregation. Up to that point, I hadn't been away from the congregation for more than a couple weeks at a time. And the congregation had never had a minister have a baby. So it was a brand new thing for all of us. I will admit that I was a little worried. I was only 3 years into my ministry here, and there had been some real challenges that year. We had a brand new staff person who started literally a month before I went on leave, and the congregation was deep in a conversation about whether or not to become a level 2 sanctuary congregation, supporting immigrants who were taking sanctuary in another church. I honestly didn't know what would happen if I let my little piece of web go for a couple months. What if it all fell apart? And what I came back to was a giant, tangled mess. However, I was about to be responsible for a tiny human for the first time, so I didn't really have a choice. I had to let go and see what would happen. Now, this could have gone a whole bunch of different ways, right? But luckily for me and for all of us here, it went the very best possible way. I came back, I believe, to a congregation that was even stronger than I left it. Those of you who were here at the time had navigated the conflict around sanctuary beautifully. And our new staff team had started to form some real bonds through the ways that they had to work together differently in my absence. And somehow, in the midst of it all, a small group of folks here had partnered with others outside our congregation to create what is now the New Hampshire Community Bail Fund, a dream that had only been in its infancy when I left. Now, just to be clear, everyone was perfectly happy for me to pick up my piece of the web again. Nobody complained that I was back. But when I had set it down, nothing had collapsed. There was no tangled mess for me to come back to. Instead, the strings had shifted, forming a new web that was just as strong, and then shifted again to allow me back in when I was ready. This is exactly the way interdependence is supposed to work. You all are doing it right. When one of us has to set down our part of the load, it doesn't mean everything falls apart. Instead, it shifts. Interdependence means that the weight of the world is not on our shoulders alone, that we carry it together instead. So when we need to say no or we set a boundary, when we take a moment to care for ourselves, the weight does not fall. It's simply redistributed. Now, sure, it might be a problem if we all let go at once, but with enough of us, we shouldn't have to worry about that. And no one is served if we burn ourselves out, if we convince ourselves that we alone are the savior of this world. In justice work, there's often this idea of taking shifts for the movement. Maybe one day I can show up and another day you can. None of us can show up all the time, but between us all, we've got this. It can be hard to believe that until you experience it, until you practice setting down your load and see that the world doesn't fall apart. So 2 years ago, around this time, I was once again preparing to be away from the congregation, this time for a sabbatical. Once again, we were in the midst of the lot. We were just emerging from the pandemic shutdown times, and we were preparing to vote on big changes to our building. Changes that would, in fact, be not only decided, but also voted on while I was away. Now, 6 years ago, me might have been a little panicked, might even have put off that sabbatical, even though I desperately needed it at the time. But 2 years ago, me had seen this community in action, so I was a lot less worried. In some ways, the stakes were even higher, but I knew that the congregation was well prepared for it. I knew that the web of interdependence would not collapse if I set down my part for a few months. Now, when I told some of my colleagues that the congregation was going to be going through this big decision-making process while I was away, they had some serious doubts about the wisdom of this plan. But I trusted that the web that we had built together would hold just fine. And luckily, you all proved me right. I once again came back to a congregation that was stronger than ever, with all kinds of new folks who were so excited to make this place their spiritual home, who I had never met, and a congregation that was excited about the next steps of our building project, having created this beautiful plan that so perfectly embodied the vision we had been dreaming about for years. It is powerful to me that in this community, even I, as a leader, am allowed to set down my load sometimes. That I, too, am worthy of boundaries. I, too, am worthy of saying no. So let this be an invitation to you, if you need it, to lay down your load for a moment, to let go of that thing that you think only you can do, to let go of the idea that you have to hold it all together alone. Because interdependence isn't about any of that. It's the give and take of truly reciprocal relationships. It is healthy boundaries, the freedom to say no, the certainty that there are others who will have your back.